Wo Long is one of Team Ninja's newest game releases, and while there are some obvious flaws to this game, it's still relatively solid at what I assume they were aiming for while developing this game. Similar to my previous review of Wukong, I'll be breaking this up into different categories. I'll also be keeping this spoiler-free like the last video. Wo Long is an adaptation of the classic Three Kingdoms novel with prominent figures such as Lu Bu and Xiao Xiao being the forefront of a lot of the events that occurred throughout the story. A majority of the story revolves around your character having to experience these historical battlefields and uncovering the true culprit behind why these soldiers and their armies are even being consumed by some sort of like demonic chi. For the most part, the pacing felt pretty quick since they needed to show a lot of these like historical time periods in some way. So there were some time skips here and there, but with that in mind, it also allowed for them to squeeze in some more character interactions between more of the prominent figures in the story, such as like the general leaders. If you've ever played Neo or even Neo 2, then the gameplay will feel very familiar to you as it uses a lot of similar mechanics and has the same feeling when it comes to the combat. While they did end up trying something different with the main combat since there's no stamina at all, there's also some sort of stagger bar, kind of similar to Sekiro in a sense. All I could think about while playing was, I kind of wish this was Neo. Don't get me wrong, the combat is still fun at its core, but it just kind of feels like a simplified version of what they've already created with something as good as Neo. There's also a different variety of weapons and armor you're able to get throughout the game in normal Team Ninja fashion. The animations are also very super over the top, which I love. They've been doing it in their other games too, and it's great. On top of that, there are what the game calls wizardry spells, which are just some nice spells you can use in between attacks that either keep your offense running or, you know, sort of preemptively start being defensive with like a shield or recover some of your gauge and stuff like that. Now remember how I said there's no stamina bar in this game? Instead, there's just one bar that acts as both your stagger and your spirit, is what the game calls it. The ways to fill this bar up is by either deflecting or landing hits. And then the way the deflect works in this game is very similar to the parry in Sekiro, where it'll fill up the enemy's stagger gauge, and then once it's full, you can use the finishing strike. You can lower the amount of stagger gauge that an enemy has by landing an attack that uses the spirit gauge, such as your wizardry spells or your weapon arts. With all those mechanics in mind, it really does feel fleshed out with the combat, but for me personally, it just didn't feel as fun and rewarding as it did in their previous games like Neo and Neo 2. With that being said, about the gameplay, the difficulty of this game was fairly normal overall. Nothing was too hard. There was a lot that was like relatively easy in my opinion. There were only about a couple times I can recall where I was actually struggling to kill a boss, maybe about like 4 or 5 bosses. The game can also be made pretty easy, whether you're playing it co-op or you have a bunch of different NPCs that you're able to summon at will too to help you kill the bosses or even just explore the levels. And speaking of exploration, if you've ever played Neo or Neo 2, then you know how good Team Ninja is at designing levels, so there's really nothing to be scared about when it comes to this game since the levels are designed just as well as those two games are. Everything feels really intertwined with each other while you're exploring, and the levels are never too big and they're never too small either, so it's like a nice middle ground. As for character design, there is a character customizer in the start of the game, but I just picked one of the presets since me personally, I'm not usually one to spend a lot of time while creating a character in these sorts of like Souls-like action games. But if that's up your alley, by all means, it is there for you guys. And when it comes to the enemy designs, it's basically split into 2 categories. There's like these normal humans with whatever weapon they're using, whether it's like a crossbow, a sword, a spear, the list goes on, or some sort of demonic version of these humans, or even animals as well. Now, in Wo Long, there is a total of 3 DLC chapters that sort of fill in the gaps, story-wise, in between the things that occurred during the main story, since like I mentioned earlier, there were some time skips. And the 3 DLCs are basically just 3 extra chapters you're able to play, and they're designed the same way as the main chapters with a couple main missions and then a bunch of sub-missions. And when it comes to the 3 DLCs, I can say confidently that the second one is my most favorite one. The third one is also really good. The first one, though, is kind of just a little bit mediocre, so overall the DLC is relatively good, though. And with those submissions that I mentioned earlier during the DLC, it's very similar to Neo, where there's a bunch of submissions that you're able to play through, and I was able to clear through all of them. And in my opinion, the DLC submissions and the extra like miscellaneous submissions were the best ones out of the bunch, since they offered like a more variety on boss fights that you're able to partake in. Because during the main mission, it was mainly just like a bunch of submissions where it was reach the end of the level and collect this item, or reach the end of the level and kill a bunch of enemies instead of like, you know, clear a level, fight a boss, or just straight up fight a boss, similar to the DLC submissions or the miscellaneous ones. Now throughout this video, there's been a BGM playing, and it's from Wo Long specifically, but overall, I can't say that anything really stood out to me while playing, but the OST does fit the theme of the game very well. Whether it's like the background playing while exploring the battlefield, or a village is burning down and you're just exploring through that, or when you're fighting one of the bosses, it all feels like it meshes really well. But I wouldn't say that anything is like very ear-catching to me personally throughout this game. So it took me around, I believe, 28 hours to complete Wo Long with the DLC as well, and all the submissions and everything. The only thing I didn't play through is New Game Plus with like the harder difficulty, because I didn't really want to. And during that time I never encountered a single bug, so props to Team Ninja in that regard. One terrible thing about the game though is the load times specifically are really bad. Sometimes they could be really quickly, like 5 seconds to 10 seconds. Other times though, they can be anywhere between like 20 seconds to even up to a minute. And I'm even playing on an NVMe, so the load time should not be taking that long, but they just were for some reason. Now, while Wo Long is a solid game, it's definitely not a must-play in my opinion. But if you are a fan of like the Three Kingdoms story and you want to experience it with some combat that has similarities to like Nioh and Sekiro, then by all means, this game might be right up your alley. But if you're like me, sort of looking for another Nioh with like a different story, then you're not really missing out on much if you decide to not play this game. That's going to be the end of my review. Hopefully I did a good job at expressing my thoughts on what I liked and what I disliked and just the game as a whole. On another note, I do stream on Twitch whenever I'm playing through any of these games that I'm going to review. The game I'm currently playing through right now will be Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, so once I finish that, I will upload a review on that game as well. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Peace.